So today I'm going to be talking about getting HTCondor and upgrading to HTCondor 9.0, kind of as two separate mini talks, because I have a lot of ground to cover, and that'll make the inevitable YouTube videos a little bit shorter. Getting HTCondor, the one URL that you will probably be able to remember and actually get to if you haven't already downloaded my talk is htcondor.org/downloads. That'll lead you to the page on the left here, which has the current channel and the stable channel. We're trying to update our vocabulary a little bit. Those correspond to the development series and the stable series, or what we used to call those. And those lead through to this other link here on the right and at the bottom of the page into our manual to a page called Getting HTCondor. And you might be wondering why I'm calling it Getting HTCondor rather than installing HTCondor. That seems kind of the natural counterpart to an upgrade. It would be an installation. It's because we want to emphasize and document the ways that you can get HTCondor without actually having to do an installation, that you can run HTCondor, you can access its features, you can experiment, you can learn. For instance, using a Docker Singularity image, we make those available at Docker Hub, among other places. If you have access to the cloud's infrastructure, then we have plenty of images on various different clouds that you can use to go ahead and spin up Condor for yourself. We have a prototype implementation that we talked about last year on the Google Cloud platform that lets you spin up a whole cluster automatically with a few clicks from your web browser. And of course, we also have Kubernetes pods that you can download and play around with if you have access to a Kubernetes cluster. The other thing we wanted to do was to simplify installing HTCondor. Make it easier, in particular, to install, to set up, and to get running secure pools. This tool called Get HTCondor is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the first half of this talk. Is mostly, in fact, entirely for Linux. It's not a command line tool. We'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to say that we're working on the Windows situation. We're updating the installer, and we got a little more work to do to make sure that the new secure configuration will interoperate properly between Windows and Linux. But to emphasize, if you're starting from scratch, you should probably pick a method appropriate for the service you're using, right? That's our suggestion. And where that service is something like whether it's Docker or Kubernetes or the cloud. And one of the advantages there is that even if you don't have a root on any particular machine, aside from possibly your machines at home, Docker effectively functions as privilege escalation for you. And so you can use all of these features of Condor that require Condor to be running with privileges. Otherwise, if you're not using a service and are root, or you have user privileges, right, you can you should use this Get HTCondor tool to install from scratch. The other case where that would come up, even if you don't have root privileges on a piece of physical hardware or on a static virtual machine, would be if you're using one of these services, but you need to start or want to start from an existing image, right? You spend a lot of time making sure that your workflow, that your job will work in this particular container. There's no point in doing all that over again. You should start with that container, run Get HTCondor on it if you need to get Condor into a container that can run your job. Otherwise, if you're an unprivileged user and you don't have access to any of these services, we still offer the tarball. We've tried to make that a little bit easier and improve the instructions a little bit. Please do tell us how that goes for you if you're one of the users that is using the tarball. The Get HTCondor tool, as I said, is our recommended way, the way that we hope that you install Condor when you do install it. It lives on the web at that URL that's highlighted in red, which is maybe the only other URL that you have a chance to remember, gethtcondor.com. And it's for new Linux installations only. And you can see here, hopefully it shows up well on your screen. I can see it on mine. That if you just go ahead, download this via curl and run it for bash, you can do that as a normal user. You can do it as a user nobody. And what it will do, I have to truncate the output because there's a lot of it. We'll just go ahead and print out what it would do. And so if you approve of the various different options that various different commands, excuse me, that it would issue, you can even just go ahead and copy and paste those back into your console and go ahead and install Condor that way. The more usual way is with this no dry run option, which says, don't print those things out, just go ahead and do them. Of course, you can have, there are legitimate security concerns about running a random script from the internet. If you just go ahead and click on those links, assuming you're following along with my presentation at home, gethtcondor.com will just spit the script back at you if you care to inspect it. Todd's demo on Monday did a really good job of showing how you do the multi-machine installation. So I just want to say here, because we'll be talking about, I'll be talking about authentication and privacy next. This pool password here, sorry, on this screen, is kind of the root of the security model and the security strength of the security for the pool that Get HTCondor installs. So it's important that it's a good password. There's no particular length on that password. And so if you want to just spit a bunch of random words out of user-dictated words at it, that's actually a pretty good way of getting the job done. The other thing I wanted to point out, part of our new manual, part of the new installation section, is that we do have an explicit and very short introduction to the 3 roles, what kind of hardware requirements they might have, what they do, and how they work together to make Condor a Condor pool function. I should mention for people who are more familiar, perhaps with the security system than maybe they want to be, we call it a password. That password is turned around and used to generate a signing token, a signing key, excuse me, for ID tokens, which is the primary security method that we'll be using for the multi-machine installation. I won't discuss the standalone installation security that much because it's all occurring over the loopback network and local to the machine. So there's very little to say or to worry about there. The multi-machine installation, of course, corresponds over the network. It uses 2 primary different methods of authentication, file systems and ID tokens. We've talked a lot about ID tokens. I won't try to go into detail about that, although if you have a question, please ask at the end of the talk. File system, if you're not familiar with it, basically tries to take advantage of the fact that if 2 processes are running on the same machine, one of them can ask the other, okay, you said you're Bob. Here's a random file name in temp. Go ahead and create that as Bob. And then it checks to see if that has happened. And if it does, that's a pretty good indication that the other process is actually Bob. So when we authorize users, we have basically 2 authorizations. Anybody that can authorize via the file system to the submit node, to the access point, excuse me, can submit jobs. And then everything else happens on the basis of a single Condor user. The name of the user is Condor. That Get HTCondor is set up an ID token for on all of the machines. And that Condor user has all of the daemon and all of the administrative privileges that it needs in order to do all of the work that Condor does. With respect to privacy, the picture is pretty good, but not perfect. All daemon-to-daemon communication is encrypted. All tool-to-daemon communication is also encrypted, except for read-only connections over the network. And the reason those are not encrypted is because Condor's security model requires authentication before it can do any encryption. And we don't want to blindly authenticate people because they're coming from the submit node, right? I'll be talking about this a little bit later in the talk, but that's this host-based security method we've been trying to get away from. If that worries you, one of the things you can do after you get HTCondor installed is issue an ID token to each user that's supposed to be able to submit jobs, is supposed to be able to read from the collector. Using Condor token create dash identity, the link there goes to the man page. I don't have time to go into more details, sadly. We don't do this as a matter of course, as part of the Get HTCondor installation, right? Imagine that you're installing this on a machine that has, whose LDAP server is your corporate server, and there are 50,000 users on it. Only 30 of whom are actually allowed to log in, right? There's no way for us to tell ahead of time which users on your machine should get ID tokens. And so we just went with the current setup. We also hope that ID tokens will make it very easy to do flocking. People have asked about for more help and more configuration assistance with doing that. Where the basic idea, right? You use this Condor token create to create a token. You add its identity to flock from if you're trying to go to remote, excuse me, if you're trying to allow a remote pool to use your resources, and then you use some secure method, SCP, whatever, to get that ID token over to that other pool. The other pool drops a copy of that token at HTCondor tokens D, adds the name of your central manager to flock to, and everything should pretty much just work. And of course, if you want to do the reverse, then you just run the steps in the opposite order. In closing, for this part of the mini talk, or for this first half of the talk, I guess I should say, there are those 2 links again, in case you missed them the first time, to go to the downloads page. And a plea for feedback, right? This is all new user experience, all new user documentation, a bunch of new code. We think we did a pretty good job everywhere, but if you have problems, let us know. If the tool does something you didn't expect it to do, let us know. If it doesn't do something that you wanted it to do, let us know. So please send us a bunch of email as you go through this process. For the second half of the talk, I will be talking about upgrading to HTCondor 9.0. And the reason this needs a talk is because this is a more complicated upgrade than you might be used to if you've upgraded before. In fact, it's complicated enough that we had to split the instruction, not just write formal instructions, but split them into 2 pieces. That's what these first and third links are. If you're upgrading from 8.8, there's one set of instructions. If you're upgrading from 8.9, there's another set of instructions. I'd like to remind you right now, if you're thinking about doing the upgrade from 8.8, we don't do automatic upgrades between stable series. And by that, I mean, if you want to upgrade to 9.0, you're going to have to install a new repo file. You're going to have to get a new repo key. You're going to have to change your repo settings if you're using apt, all that good stuff, right? Just running apt-get or running yum update is not going to bring you up to 9.0. And we do that on purpose in this case and in other cases because there might be problems. And we want you to be aware and be prepared and make that a conscious decision. So what I'm going to do for this talk is give you an overview of those issues. I don't have time to go into the details of the issues or the details of their solutions. Those are all written down in the documentation. But I want to give you an idea about what you can expect, give you a chance to ask questions at the end if you have any concerns as well. So the three areas are security. We've talked about secure by default for 9.0. I'll go into a little bit about what that means for you as somebody who's upgrading from 8.8 to 9.0. The other big issue, and that affects the 8.9 upgrade the most, is ID tokens. And we'll talk about what that means. And then the last thing you should do is go take a look. And this is mostly for 8.8, because if you're using 8.9, you already have most of the changes in 9.0. There have been a bunch of changes, new features that Christina and Greg talked about earlier, but also a few semantic changes that you just need to be aware of and account for when you upgrade your pool. The big deal here, the default configuration is no longer host-based. And the problem with that from your point of view is potentially this is going to break or has a very good chance of breaking your configuration. There's basically 4 options here, one of which is, I'll get into the 4 options shortly. Reinstall from scratch, reconfigure, revert to host-based security, or retain your existing strong security if you already configured it. For those last 2 cases, right, if you don't start your configuration over from scratch, you may have obsolete configuration and you need to update that so that it'll continue to work in 9.0. And I'll give a brief overview of that. And again, I want to emphasize you want to read the instructions for all the details that I can't go into here. Reinstall. That's why part of the reason we talked about getting HTCondor first. This is kind of an unplottable option for many people, but in the way that back when Microsoft used to actually release new versions of Windows, right? If you had some weird problem after an upgrade, the advice was always back up your data, reinstall from scratch, so that you got to a place that was well-known, well-tested by Microsoft, and that everybody was familiar with, right? This is this brand new installation. There'll be a lot of help on the web if you have problems because everybody else is in the same situation. Of course, before you upgrade, you might want to run and save the output from contrconfig val-summary. That'll tell you the differences between your configuration as you've written it out in your configuration files and the default configuration for that version of Condor. That might be useful information to know. You might want to back up your spool. I don't think the RPMs or the debs could clear the spool out for you when you uninstall, but just to make sure that they don't do that. So uninstall Condor, remove the previous configuration, right? The whole point here is to get this nice new get HTCondor configuration. Then go see the previous talk, run get HTCondor, get your new copy, get your new installation on all the machines. And then you need to go through, remove all the security configuration, right? You don't want to override all the work that get HTCondor just did, but you do want your things like your job transforms, copy that back into HTCondor config day. Another option that involves a little less back and forth would be to try to reconfigure, which basically means keep everything in place, try to remove all of your security settings, and then do what get HTCondor would have done for you on all of your machines by creating a signing key and using that signing key to create an ID token. That's a little trickier potentially because you are going to be looking at your configuration kind of in place and how do I want to say it? It's almost like it's modifying live, isn't it? But moving on. Your third option, of course, is to revert. We hope you don't choose to do this, but we understand if you have to. And when I say revert, I mean revert back to host-based security. There are instructions both in the previous links that I've used and in the configuration file that we drop in place that tell you how to do this. Briefly, you comment out use recommended security v9.0. You uncomment use security host-based. And it's important that you do those two things and not just delete that file, because that if you upgrade to v901, 902, whatever later on, we'll drop this file into place again because we want to try and get people to use it regardless of when they upgraded it. If once you've done that, because you're keeping your old configuration around, be sure not to forget to update it. In particular, allow daemon does no longer inherits from allow write. So if you don't set that, if you don't configure that, a number of your daemons may no longer be able to advertise themselves to the collector. And in 8.8, the other thing, other big one, we deprecated host allow and host deny, and then I know those are just gone. So the config, it won't crash, right? You can set whatever random variables you want, but they will have no effect. And then, of course, if you're already using a more secure approach, right? You're using GSI, you're using SSL, maybe you're using Kerberos, whatever it is, user-based security, same sort of deal. You can go ahead and just completely empty out that config file that we dropped in place. But again, don't delete it because otherwise it'll be reinstalled and screw things up for you again. Same sort of deal with the obsolete configuration as on the previous slide as well. Right, you're upgrading from your binaries are changing, so you need to make sure that these things are updated to match. If you're upgrading from 8.9, this really only applies if you were already using ID tokens. And if you already were using ID tokens, thank you. It was super helpful to us to have people trying that out in the development series. And one of the results there is that we found a bug with how the ID tokens method reads its signing keys. Those signing keys are how it verifies these ID tokens that are being presented to it, claiming to be proof that that other daemon is a particular or has a particular authentication. The upshot of that is that some of the signing keys will be read differently as a result, and some of the ID tokens signed by that key, or the ID tokens, all of them signed by that key, will no longer work in 9.0. We wrote a tool called Condor Check Password to look for this kind of key. If it detects that kind of key, it'll tell you about two different options, and do one of them if you select it, which is to truncate the key. That has obvious strength of security implications, right? The shorter the key is, the easier it is for an attacker to brute force your privacy and your security. Unfortunately, the only other option is to issue yourself a new key that's full length, and then reissue all of the old tokens, replace them with new tokens, and redistribute them, which I understand is a pain in the ass, but there's nothing we can do about that. Sorry. So in closing for this half of the talk, I cannot emphasize this enough that you should be reading the documentation before you upgrade. Those are links to the documentation again. The other thing to consider is putting your jobs on hold before you go through this upgrade process. I think there's a lot of room for this to take a while, for it to be complicated, for there to be mistakes, and you have to figure out what's going on. And it might be best to do that just for simplicity reasons without your users' jobs running, right? If you need to submit test jobs, right, that makes sense, go ahead and do that. But this way, you'll know everything about what's supposed to be happening because you're responsible for all of it. And you won't have to explain some of the weird error messages that might show up if a user job tries to run in the middle of this upgrade process. I want to emphasize here, actually, that 8.8 and 9.0 and 8.9 and 9.0 are actually wire compatible, right? They will work together in the same pool if the security is configured configured appropriately. It's just that by default, the security is not configured to interoperate with each other. And that's what this is, most of this half of the talk was about. In closing, if you have questions, htcondoradmin@cs.wis.edu is the email address to use to ask. I believe Mark will tell me that I have a few minutes left for questions right now. And more importantly, there are office hours later today. And so if you have more in-depth questions, I recommend you come by my office hours or others' office hours in the administrative room and ask us what's going on. Thank you for your time.